Well, this has to do with such geopolitical issues of wanting to have to be the arbiter, if you will, of whatever happens in the Middle East. And we know that great nations have often played each other. So there's the, if you will, the shadowy interests of the moneyed powers here in the United States, the industrial, the big multinational corporations. So the economy's stupid aspect is not stupid. Underneath this is always this economic base. And so, as I say, there's this playing off. Now, there's no question that at this particular point in time, there is a significant Jewish backing here and a significant, as you know, Christian backing from one segment, if you will, of the Christian population. And both their interests are being served now, I think, mainly because of these other larger interests that are not so easy to put your hands on. It serves their interests as well. So there's another of interest now. And so we have the Jewish interests, and remember that's not every Jewish person now, either in Israel or the United States, is able to manipulate, if you will, the desire to create an exclusive Jewish state. At this particular time, our governments and our people, and able to manipulate due to, if you will, Holocaust guilt, Christian Zionists because of their, and that isn't a completely apt term, because there are Christian Zionists who are Christian Zionists for eschatological reasons, but do not back what is being done to the Palestinians. But let's say this particular segment of Christian population who sees a scriptural need based on interpretations of Revelation and interpretations that aren't in Revelation, a need to have the Jews running that part of the world. So it's all of those. You know, like I said, it wasn't a land without a people. He may be talking about how Jews trace their religion through the mothers. I don't know. It's a bit confused.
Well,
it's a bit
talking
confused.
About Sephardic Jews? I mean,
Who knows?
on your map, before 48, they all lived there together, and they wouldn't have minded being called Palestinian Jew. You see, they were Arabs, Christians, and Jews living in Palestine together. But when European Jews, the little group of them came with a vision of having a Jewish state, then that's the difference. But the Arab Jews still call themselves Arab Jews.
To begin with, and Sis will talk about the educational end, but on the political end, it would seem no matter who's elected that if you come from the perspective that we have, then there's not going to be a dime's worth of difference with respect to Israeli-Palestinian policies, whether Kerry is elected or Bush. That being the case, the pressure must be kept on continuously on your local representatives, your senators, or whatever. That doesn't mean by keeping the pressure on that you're going to turn them around. But they must not forget for 1 minute that we are out there. And I do think it means, however, that either Kerry or Bush wins, if you Kerry or Bush wins, that perhaps the ratcheting of the presence in their offices, outside their offices, insisting on meetings with not just the senators, but also their staff members who are responsible to them on this particular issue, I think it has to be continuous. And perhaps, as I say, the amount of pressure and calls and what have you needs to be ratcheted up. For the short-term future, they must not ever feel that we are not out there. I think, what about education?
It's very hard to get it in a few words, but because I'm just focused on the children, and in a way, I think I've given up on the adults. But I'm seeing wisdom, creativity, and hope in the children who don't want this for a life. And I believe they can be nurtured and encouraged and supported to have a better life than the unilateral, militant solution to what we call conflict. Our knee-jerk, unilateral, we don't need anybody else in the world, military answer. And I want to add to this, and it pains me to do this, but we have so much violence here, everywhere they look, and they're being raised in it. And about 7 months ago, I saw Laura Bush on television, and my heart was in my throat. She's a teacher, and she said, unquestionably, violence is epidemic-sized in America, in our schools. And I have the answer, she said. We'll take all the retired military and put them in the schools, and we'll get discipline back. Now, I think we've got to challenge that. We're going to lose our children.
So, political...
What would it matter if we gained the whole world and lost them?
We have political education. Now coming back to the economic. Some of you, I'm sure, know that it's about a month now that the Presbyterian Church at their annual conference have voted to divest themselves of certain Israeli holdings, and I think, and I'm not positive, holdings of U.S. companies that deal in violence with Israeli customers and what have you. They're studying that, and they will come up with a plan, I think, by the end of the year. I think what we can all do, if you, again, come from the same perspective and think the way we do, is to tell your pastors and you, get in touch, seriously, letters, emails to the officials of the Presbyterian Church. Their headquarters is in Louisville, I think, and tell them you support them. And you want them to go ahead, because we know already, as you can imagine, when they took that vote, they are under tremendous pressure, being accused of anti-Semitism and the whole thing, to not follow through on this. And then I would hope, while we're encouraging the Presbyterian Church to stay its course, that we might interest the hierarchies or the leadership in our other denominations here to follow the Presbyterian lead and get behind them and do the same thing. Education, political, economic. Sure. And of course, we can all boycott companies, both over there that sell goods here and our own that deal in an unsatisfactory way. I think, number one, to start insisting that the administration obey all of the restrictions in our foreign military aid that we give them, because they're in the military and foreign aid that we have, there are restrictions that say if Israeli does that, we don't do this. And number one is the continuation of building the settlements. That's just number one. And number two is the use of our Apache helicopters and what have you for killing children and women and men who are not involved in the fighting, while these Apache helicopters and tanks and what have you are in the process of assassinating Palestinian leaders one by one, none of whom has it ever proved that they were terrorists. I'm not saying that some of them undoubtedly may not have been connected with them. But you read our own coverage in our newspapers now. The newspapers, without blinking, say the Israelis say they killed this man because he was a terrorist, or he was a leader of the militant thing. They don't even say alleged. And of course, that's another thing about how our how our media covers the paper. That's another one.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
In one sentence, my Israeli colleagues say, support Israel in the occupation. In the occupation. Everything would change if we end the occupation. And say to Israel, in the occupation or else, we are not going to pay for the illegal military occupation of another people. We're not going to do it.
Where would you draw the lines of that occupation? I mean,
well, there's practically nothing left. It's only a little 9% of their country.
Right. And this is, of course, which I've showed you, the 1967 border. This is what the mass of Palestinians, this is what the mainstream says. Now, there are people, and we're one of them, who say that's the reality, and the Palestinians, the mainstream, most Palestinians understand the reality of the world in which they live, and they, for many, many years now, are more than willing to settle for the settlements going and the 1967 borders. There are many like us who feel ideally it would be nice if you could have an ideal which would be a pluralistic, non-exclusive, unitary state. That's what I would prefer, and many Palestinians and many of the Jews do too. But the fact of the matter is, since most Palestinians, and I say that with, this we know, most Palestinians, for a variety of reasons, will settle for the concept, will settle for the 1967 borders. It's not for us to tell them what they ought to settle for. That's what the Israelis are doing, and that's what our government is doing now. So, get out of the West Bank and Gaza. Well, that's a very good question, because in withdrawing, there's some other issues, like the fact that the settlements, most of the settlements in the West Bank are built along a high mountain ridge for strategic reasons, but they also sit on the aquifers where the water comes from. And the fact of the matter is now that the Israelis are drawing off 80% of the water that comes up through these aquifers in the West Bank and reserving it for pumping it into Israel and giving it to the settlers. 400,000 settlers get 85% of the water. The Palestinians, about 1.2 million or 1.7 million, I'm not sure which, get about 15%. This is not a cliche when I tell you it's horrendous to drive down Highway 60, the major northwest bypass road, to go by settlements, see green grass growing, see swimming pools, and next door to them are parched Palestinian fields. And not only that, you run along and you'll see a broken water pipe where the Israeli settlers have come down with the protection of the Israeli soldiers and broken their pipes to draw off the little bit of water that they do get. Who would have thought that the next war would have been about oil? Kind of. I mean, we know that's what it was about. And you're of course right, because it isn't just Palestine and Israel now. We have tremendous anxiety between Syria and Turkey and other places in the Middle East where the waters flow down, the headwaters come, and then they go across borders. And you're right, this is becoming a more precious resource, and who knows what the next wars will be fought over. There's about 30 miles or so of the wall that's been built. Right now it's been being built along the western edge. The money has been appropriated already by the Knesset to build it completely around the West Bank, 400 miles. Where there isn't a wall, there is a system of fences like you would have around, a maximum security prison. Huge fences, electrified, with sensors and television cameras, and these maybe a 20-foot wide smooth sand road, like on a recently smooth sandy beach, which the Army patrols ever so often to see if they can find footprints in it. And so there's this fence. There are very few openings in the wall. Now, the openings are there ostensibly because the Israelis have said, well, of course we know we have separated the villages from their fields, so we have these fences so you can come through to work your fields. But that is a fiction. The fences are rarely opened. You never know when the soldiers are come down. I have a very good friend, one of the internationally celebrated Sufi Muslim exponents of nonviolence in the world. He happens to be a Palestinian who helped to found the Palestinian Institute for the Study of Nonviolence, along with a Christian Palestinian by the name of Mubarak Awad. My friend Nafis Asali, his father's home in Hebron, where he takes his kids in the summer, used to have 32 acres of grape arbors and peach trees and plum trees, 32 acres. And over the decades, there's one of these settlements built on the hill overlooking where his house is. Over the decades, they have slowly, every 4 or 5 years, brought a fence down and confiscated the land between the fence and the the settlement on top of the hill. Last January, they finally took the very last piece of it. He has no more of his land left. Well, they said, and so he called CPT. He said, I need to get in to prune my grapes. This was in February. Maybe if you come and we do an action, if you go in there, we may be able to call attention to the fact they're not letting us through the grapes. Of course, we did do it. We knew what would happen because it rarely works. We went in within 15 minutes. They came and they kicked us out. And the man on the officer who came down to kick us back out said, you know that you can go through. All you have to do is call. And my friend Nava says, we call 4 or 5 times a day for the past month. Nobody answers. Nobody answers. What am I going to do? And the soldier just says with a snicker, call. This is the problem. Well, if this should happen to you in the future, say, look, I just came back from a presentation given by a Jew, Sis Levin. And his presentation, he showed me pictures of tens of thousands of Israeli Jews and Jews in the United States going over to help the Palestinians. So I cannot be anti-Semitic because I really like what those Jews are doing. I like them a lot. And that's the point that I'm trying to make. Don't let these really selfish, acquisitive American Jews or Israeli Jews try to convince you that Judaism, which is a lot of things, it's secular, it's religious, as we see, is a monolith. And a monolith that to a man, woman, and child thinks all Arabs are terrorists. There are hundreds of thousands of them here and over there who care about their Palestinian brothers and are just livid with rage, but also helpless frustration at what their co-religionists or their co-ethnicists, if you will, their co-heritage are wreaking in that part of the world. Well, 2 things. First of all, if that's what they were chosen for, to do that to the Palestinians, I don't want to have anything to do with it. That's a personal thing. But as far as this covenant, I think we all know that the covenant had less to do with real estate than it had to do with conduct. The Holy Land or the Promised Land or whatever it was, God told them in 10 different ways in this story, was to be a gold star on their conduct chart, on their chart of deportment, if we will, how they treated their fellow man. And he warned them, you treat them badly, sin or whatever you want to call it, that gold star gets off and you go out. Well,
not only that, every time they behaved that way in the Bible, they lost the land.
That's what I mean.
I think it's really important, since they are your friends, that you read some of the really fine books. Some of them are very scholarly, some of them are very easy to read. I think maybe the best of the easier ones to read is Colin Chapman's Whose Promised Land? Whose Promised Land? ? And he very, very carefully lays out those sections of the Bible that they're claiming relate to the covenant. You see, it's very easy to yank things out of the Bible and claim that, and if you don't know how to answer that, they get away with it. So it's worth your while to look. God really is not in the real estate business, and it isn't stated that way in the Bible. But the televangelists like Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson get away with messing with the minds of all of their followers, and we ought to resent that. It's bad theology. It's not true to Scripture, Christian, Muslim, or Jew, and it's really playing with the soul of good people.
I could mention one other book written by a man who just died, Michael Pryor, a great Catholic theologian in Britain, who's written a book called The Bible and Colonialism, and it's a very fast read. It is a very important book because it doesn't only deal with this misinterpretation or deliberate obfuscation of the Bible and the subject of colonialism with respect to the Holy Land. He points out how, of course, that's what motivated or what the leaders of Europe used to rationalize what they did over here 400 and 500 years ago. And in South Africa and elsewhere. It's a fast read, it's an easy read, and if anybody really wants to understand what the Bible really is about, then read this book, The Bible and Colonialism, which tells you what too many people have tried to convince us that it's about. The Bible and Colonialism by Michael Pryor, P-R-I-O-R.
It actually gets close to the racism of Hitler, who was baptized Christian, incidentally. When you get to this was promised us exclusively by God, you're dealing with racism, and I just don't think it stands up. I've spent many, many years in schools of theology. In Beirut, we read the Sermon on the Mount in Aramaic, Jesus' own language. And he doesn't leave you any wiggle room at all for violence. None. And yet here we are having onward Christian soldiers off to war. And yet if you care to know what Jesus said, it's impossible to do that.
He's lost his majority. He's lost about a number of votes of no confidence the past few weeks. The people to the further right of him have deserted him because he's devised this plan to disengage, he calls it, from Gaza, and they don't like that. They don't feel they should leave any part of it out. But of course, he's a politician, and even though he's a brutal politician, he's somewhat of a realist. And I'll explain why Gaza, to the middle right, if you will, is not as important as the West Bank in a moment. But he's doing that because he knows he'd rather deal with the anger of the settlers with respect to Gaza than the anger of the settlements in the West Bank. And so he's only proposed dismantling 4 tiny little settlements way up in the north and retaining all of the West. Now, the political thinking behind disengaging from Gaza, and he knows it's creating the problem that it has for him, is that from a scriptural history, Gaza is along the Mediterranean. The plains is far less important to Jewish Hebrew history than is what Begin and the others call Judea and Samaria. From the mountains in which Jerusalem lies east to the Jordan River and beyond. That is Canaan. That's the original land of milk and honey that they were trying to make. And of course now for ultra-nationalists, every square inch is important. For ultra-Orthodox nationalist Jews, it isn't quite important. So what he has to do now politically is what he's trying to do. He's lost his right, so he's trying to, he's probably going to do it. He's going to form a new national unity government with labor, which is what I said to you early. Labor, to me, there's not a dime's worth of difference about what the territorial aspirations are between labor and Likud. And he'll probably form it. And there again, a man like Shimon Peres will show his true colors, and he'll probably slip by. Now, there's always the possibility, like Rabin, who again I think there wasn't a dime's worth of difference in terms of ideology or the ultimate goal between Rabin the day he died and Sharon. None at all. Rabin has made a great hero because he was a much cleverer politician in that respect. But I think he'll probably slip by. But we know that he's enraged these settlers on the right, and it's possible he could be assassinated just by Rabin. I mean, history is replete by your own religion, your own nationality. If you stray too far from the rigid ideology, you're going to end up murdered by them than by your so-called enemies. They do adhere to this concept of the government being essentially real estate. There is also something that has to do with the book of Revelation, which Sis, I think, can explain a little bit better to me. But they use the Old Testament, one of the oldest parts of the Old Testament, the covenant, and the very last book.
It's called eschatology, and this is what Falwell is focused on mostly. Pat Robertson slightly less, but mostly. And for instance, when Jerry Falwell asked me to come and speak in his church, he thought Southern Christian, Jewish husband kidnapped. He flew me down in the plane Israel had given him to talk. And when I talked, he tried to unplug the microphone and get me out of there quick. And we talked, and he said, "Don't you want to be raptured?" Have you heard this expression? You're hearing this over. Well, first place, the word rapture is not in the Bible. And so I said, "Mr. Falwell, we don't have the same view of eschatology. You know, Jesus himself said very clearly, I don't know when the end time is. Only the Father knows. But I say this to you, inasmuch as you've done for the least of these, you've done for me." That made him furious, because nobody crosses him. Somebody needs to, and preferably a scholarly man rather than a woman, because he's really quite a chauvinist. But he was furious and couldn't get me out of there quick enough. It's kind of fun for me, because I need to talk to people like this, and we need to know what language they're using so that it can be discussed fairly with those who are swallowing it wholesale. He says, the Bible says, the Jews must have all the land in order for Christians to be raptured, which is translated to meet Jesus coming down in the air. Now, the Jews are delighted that the Christian Zionists feel this way, and they laugh all the way to the bank. But of course, if you read between the lines, this theory, and that's what it is, means that only a handful will actually be saved, and all the rest are going to hell. But that's all right with the Jews as long as we keep the billions coming into Israel. As we've all said, politics make very strange religious bedfellows.
My brother.
Oh, really?
Sister blocking. Hi.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for your questions. We did the right thing to ask these basic questions, because some people are embarrassed to do that, and they're so basic, but they're the ones that the opposition throws at you.
Sure.
So they- Oh, yeah, sure. Take a CBT brochure. All right. Well, come on. You see, you're never too old to be in CPT, as you can see. Hi. Thank you. Appreciate your comment.